At 3:14 a.m. on August 15th, 1977, a crackle of static gave way to an unearthly signal so startling an astronomer circled it in red ink and scrawled "Wow" in the margin, then it vanished, leaving only questions and an eerie silence. I've thought about that moment more times than I can count. Decades later, despite faster telescopes, declassified UFO files, and all our scanning, the same emptiness persists. That unanswered echo is at the heart of everything I've tried to uncover. If the galaxy holds billions of stars and habitable worlds, why has no definitive sign of intelligent life ever reached us? And what dark truths might be hidden behind that cosmic silence? You ever wonder if the first sign of life beyond Earth would be a blip so quiet it slipped past 100 trained ears? That's what I think about whenever I replay that night in my mind when the static spoke to me. If you're curious to hear more, you can subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll be sharing every piece of this story as I uncover it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and how your day is going. I'd love to hear from you. Let's dive into the story. I was 24, barely a year out of grad school, clinging to the midnight shift at Green Bank Observatory. The pay was forgettable, but I didn't care. Every hour I spent alone with that colossal dish felt like a wager. Maybe tonight would be the night the universe finally whispered back. The control room smelled like stale coffee and old cables. My only company was the soft hum of the receiver and the tick of a brass clock above the main console. It was 2:07 a.m. when the signal hit. I'd just set my coffee down, pressing my headphones tight against my ears. A click, a thin crackleland, then a burst so clean it jolted me upright. Prime number intervals, rising in sequence, then cutting off mid-pattern. I sat there, frozen, my heart climbing up my throat. There was no cosmic noise that precise, no random wave that orderly. I toggled the recording deck with a trembling finger, watching the red light blink as the waveform etched itself across the tape. The burst lasted exactly 37 seconds. Then nothing, just the background hiss of empty sky. I didn't know what to do. Every protocol drilled into me said I should log it, flag it for review, and move on. But I couldn't. Not when everything I'd ever believed about our cosmic loneliness had just been proven false in less than a minute. I pulled off the headphones and stared at the blinking cursor on the screen, unable to breathe. That's when Dr. Lowell, my mentor, appeared in the doorway. He was in his 60s, thin as a rail, with a face that looked carved from exhaustion, but his eyes were awake in a way I'd never seen. He didn't say a word at first, just scanned the console, then the tape deck, then me. Finally, he whispered, "Don't log it." I swallowed. "But this could be, I know what it could be," he said. His voice was so low I had to lean in to catch every word. "And that's exactly why you can't log it." He shut down the recording deck himself, hands moving with deliberate calm. He pulled the tape free, slipped it into a plain manila envelope, and tucked it inside his jacket. When he turned to me, there was a kind of sorrow in his expression, like he was about to apologize for something he could never explain. "Meet me at my house. Midnight tomorrow," he said. "Bring nothing. Tell no one." Then he was gone. Just the echo of the door shutting behind him, leaving me in a silence that felt enormous. I didn't sleep the next day. I lay on my couch, replaying the signal in my mind, counting out the primes on my fingers until they blurred together. I knew I should be afraid, but all I felt was clarity, like I'd glimpsed something I could never unsee. The next night, I drove out to Lowell's place, a modest ranch on the edge of a black field, where the sky looked close enough to touch. His porch light was off, but the back gate was unlatched. I slipped through it, my breath catching as I saw the glow of fire behind the house. Lowell stood by a rusted burn barrel, feeding in wads of paper that ignited in silent flashes. The flames lit his face in flickering orange. His movements were methodical, almost resigned. When he saw me, he didn't look surprised. He nodded for me to come closer. I took a step, then another, until the heat of the barrel grazed my skin. "These are the logs," he said softly. "Signal reports, observation, schedules, internal memos, all of it. You're destroying everything." I asked, voice shaking. His eyes locked onto mine. "You think they'll let this out? You think they'll let humanity know we're not alone before they've decided how to spin it?" He tossed another stack into the fire, and a column of black ash twisted into the sky. "This gets buried until someone finds a way to profit from it or weaponize it." He reached into his coat pocket and drew out the manila envelope, now charred at the edges. My heart lurched. I thought he meant to burn it too. Instead, he held it out to me. "I can't keep this. I'm already under review. You're still nobody to them. That's your shield." I took it. The envelope felt heavier than it should, have like it contained not just the tape, but the sum of every question I'd ever asked about the dark between the stars. "Swear to me," he said, his voice rough. "Swear you'll keep it safe. If you ever find someone you trust, someone who can finish this, you pass it on." My fingers tightened around the envelope. The flames reflected in his eyes as I whispered, "I swear." He nodded once, then turned back to the barrel. The last of the printouts vanished into the heat, their embers spiraling up into the cold sky. I stood there for a long time after he was done, neither of us speaking. When the fire died to a glow of coals, I finally asked, "What happens now?" Lowell's shoulders sagged. "Now I disappear. They'll come asking. They'll pretend they're just verifying protocols, but it's already decided. You were never here tonight. I never told you anything." He didn't look at me again, just reached for a battered canvas bag at his feet, slung it over his shoulder, and walked into the dark. I listened until the sound of his steps faded into the night. Then I tucked the envelope under my jacket, climbed back over the fence, and drove into town with my headlights off. I didn't know where this would end, whether it would ever end, but I knew one thing with perfect certainty. I'd heard the static, and it had called to me, and whatever waited on the other side of that signal, I was already part of it. The first thing I noticed was the smell of burnt plastic, scorched metal, something acrid that clung to my lungs even through the mask. I'd pulled over my face. It was almost dawn when I slipped through the back entrance of the Harvard lab, my hands shaking as I picked the lock. In the weeks since Lowell vanished, I'd tried to convince myself that the tape was an overblown anomaly, that it couldn't possibly be part of anything larger. But when I got Ortiz's message, just 3 words, Phoenix was purged, all that denial fell away. Inside the lab was a graveyard. The overhead lights were blown out, leaving only the jumpy beam of my flashlight. Server racks stood twisted and blackened, their cables melted into slick ropes. On the tile floor, fragments of hard drives crunched under my boots. It didn't look like an accident. It looked like someone had torched the place with surgical focus, leaving nothing but ruin. I kept moving, forcing my breath steady. Ortiz had warned me there might be something left behind if I knew where to look. So I started at the the bases of the consoles, the seams of the walls, every place someone might have tucked something in a hurry. That was when I noticed a trail of soot-black footprints leading away from the main server. They were small, maybe a woman's shoes, but each step had a defined edge, like the person had been carrying something heavy enough to make them drag their feet. My heart kicked harder. I followed the trail across the lab, past a smashed terminal where the last memo still clung half-burned to the wall. The ink had bled in the heat, but I could still read 3 words. Secure everything immediately. I crouched by the final set of footprints, sweeping my light under a fallen monitor stand. A sliver of plastic gleamed back. I reached in and pulled out a half-melted USB drive. The casing was warped, the connector bent sideways, but it was something. I tucked it into my coat, trying not to think about what it had cost whoever left it behind. A low beep made me spin. For a second, I thought someone was behind me, but it was only the emergency battery backup dying, surrendering the last of its charge. The shadows swallowed the lab again. I didn't linger. My nerves were strung too tight, and I had the sense that whoever torched this place might still be close. Outside, dawn was turning the sky a pale violet. I slipped into a side alley, keyed in the encrypted number Ortiz had given me, and waited. It rang 6 times before her voice came on sharp, hushed, like she was speaking from the dark end of a tunnel. "You're alive." "Barely," I whispered. "It's gone, Ortiz. All of it. But I found a drive. Meet me tonight." A pause, static crackling. "3rd Ward warehouse, loading dock 9. I'll bring the decryption rig." Then she hung up. I pocketed the phone and leaned against the cold brick, my breath clouding the air. I kept thinking about those footprints, about someone risking everything to leave me a piece of the story, and for the first time, I felt something. Worse than fear, responsibility. If you don't see this through, I told myself, nobody will. The warehouse looked deserted when I arrived after dark. A chain-link fence ran the length of the loading bays, padlocked except for one gap just wide enough to slip through. I ducked inside and moved along the wall until I spotted Ortiz's outline near a stack of pallets. She wore a heavy wool coat, her black hair tucked under a watch cap, a small canvas bag in her hand. "Show me," she said without preamble. I pulled out the drive, and she studied it in the beam of her flashlight. It scorched, but the chips might still read. Inside, she led me to a folding table set up beneath a single hanging bulb. She unpacked a rugged laptop and a small device the size of a paperback, some kind of forensic reader. Her hands were sure as she slotted in the drive and tapped a series of keys. While the decryption process ran, I paced. My thoughts kept circling, back to the Harvard lab, the final memo, the careful footprints, the absolute precision of the destruction. Someone had planned this. Someone who wanted Project Phoenix erased from every record. Ortiz looked up. "There's audio." She turned the laptop so I could see the progress bar. A single file, time-stamped 12 hours before the fire. The name was a string of random characters. "Play it," I said. She hit the spacebar at first. There was only static. Then a woman's voice, ragged with panic. "They're watching, already inside." A burst of noise swallowed her words. "Don't let them take the another crackle. Promise me you'll finish it then." Silence. I stared at the screen, feeling the shape of my denial dissolve for good. Whoever she was, she'd died to get that message out. Ortiz tapped a key, bringing up the file metadata. "Look," she pointed at a field labeled Origin, a numbered IP address I didn't recognize. But beneath it, in plain text, was a label. Echo Node 7. My mouth went dry. Echo, as in the network. She nodded slowly. This is bigger than Phoenix. Echo is the failsafe. If they can't erase something, they bury it behind layers of disinformation. I thought of Lowell burning the tapes in his backyard. If they can't control the narrative, they scorch it to the ground. Ortiz closed the laptop and fixed me with that unflinching stare she always had when she was about to tell me something I wouldn't want to hear. You need to decide how far you're willing to go. If you keep chasing this, it won't stop until you're underground or on the run. They already know you were at Greenbank. The lab fire was a warning. I opened my mouth, then shut it. I wanted to say I was ready, that nothing would scare me off. But that wasn't true. My hands were trembling. My chest was tight. I wasn't ready, not really, but I was already in it. I took a slow breath. If there's even a chance the truth is still out there, then we can't stop. Her expression softened just a little. She slipped a slip of paper across the table. Coordinates. A dead drop site near Montauk. There's a storage locker with original Phoenix archives. They moved everything right before the purge. Why are you helping me? I asked quietly. Ortiz didn't look away. Because once, someone helped me when I was too naive to understand what I was walking into. We sat in silence for a moment, the cold seeping up from the concrete dot. Then she packed up her gear and stood. Be ready, she said. Once you open that locker, there's no going back. She vanished into the shadows before I could answer. I slipped out the same gap in the fence, every sense straining for movement. The neighborhood was silent except for the rustle of trash in the wind. Back in my car, I unfolded the slip of paper. My thumb traced the faded grid coordinates. Some part of me still hoped that if I just stopped now, if I went home and destroyed the tape, this would all fade away. But as I sat there in the dark, I knew better, because even if I gave up, someone else would die trying to bury this. And even if I ran, I'd never stop hearing that woman's voice crackling through the static. Their watching eye closed my fist around the coordinates. If this was a war over the truth, then I had just chosen my side. I never thought a cheap diner at the edge of Cambridge would be the place where everything I believed about science would start to crack. But that's where I ended up 3 nights after the warehouse meeting with Ortiz, sitting in a cracked vinyl booth that smelled of burnt coffee and fryer grease, waiting for someone I'd never met to walk in and change my life. Outside, the city was buried under rain. I'd parked 2 blocks away, doubled back 3 times to be sure I wasn't followed. I was jumpy more than I wanted to admit. Every headlight sweeping across the window made my heart kick harder. I'd been given only a first name, Reed, supposedly a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower protections. Ortiz said he could be trusted. I wasn't sure I believed her, but at this point, trust wasn't a luxury I could afford to ration. At 9:14, the door chimed. A man stepped in, dripping water onto the tiled floor. He looked older than I expected, grey, hair trimmed close, thick glasses that magnified eyes the color of smoke. He paused just inside, scanning the booths until his gaze landed on me. He didn't smile, just nodded once, as if we were two commuters who'd agreed to share a cab. He slid into the seat across from me and set a canvas messenger bag on the table. You're late, I said before I could stop myself. His expression didn't change. I was early. I waited outside to see who came in before me. That shut me up. He unzipped the bag and drew out a slim brown folder. edges curled from moisture. He laid it between us. "This is why I agreed to meet," he said, voice low but steady. "You need to understand how deep this goes." I glanced around. The diner was nearly empty. A kid at the counter with earbuds. An old woman stirring a cup of tea. No one paid us any attention. I opened the folder. Inside were copies of emails, invoices, and typed meeting notes, all stamped with different government agency seals. But the dates and names repeated, like an echo running through. A tunnel dot red tapped the first page. "You know what the rare earth hypothesis is?" I nodded slowly. "The idea that intelligent life is incredibly unlikely. That we're alone because everything about Earth is too improbable to repeat. It's a story," he said. "A comforting one. Makes funding easier when you promise there's nothing out there to threaten national interests." I flipped to the next document-series of wire transfers routed through 4 shell companies. Each transaction was labeled as a grant to research institutions I recognized. NASA Ames, the European Southern Observatory, a private exoplanet lab in Arizona. Your sister's startup, Reed said quietly. I felt my stomach twist. What about it? He turned another page, revealing a printout of a payment $2 million, rooted from a foundation I'd never heard of. But the foundation was just a front. The actual source was buried 3 layers deeper in the chain, marked only by an abbreviation, PGC Phoenix Group Consortium, Reed said. A collective of aerospace and energy conglomerates. They fund studies that reinforce the rare earth narrative, makes it easier to discredit any anomaly. I kept reading, though my hands had gone cold. The next email was a memo from a NASA administrator to the consortium's board. Recommend immediate suppression of K218b. Spectrooxygen and methane ratios will trigger media speculation. Better to reframe as instrument noise. I looked up, voice thin. My sister doesn't know any of this. Most scientists don't, he said. They take the grants, trust the peer review process, never suspect the strings attached. My mind reeled. I thought of her bright-eyed phone calls, all the nights she'd worked late analyzing telescope data she believed could prove Earth wasn't unique. I forced myself to keep going. A final page, this one handwritten, photocopied so many times the letters blurred at the edges. Secure the narrative. If citizen science gains traction, discredit early. Target influencers, amplify ridicule. The last line struck me like a slap. Belief is the first line of defense. If they stop believing, they start looking. I closed the folder and rubbed my eyes. So all this time, they weren't just ignoring evidence, they were burying it. Reed exhaled slowly. Not just burying, weapon. Doubt. A flicker of anger fled in me, hot enough to burn through the exhaustion. Why are you showing me this? Because you still have the original signal. He studied my face, unblinking. And they know you're out here. You can either hide, or you can drag this into daylight. 100 arguments rose to my tongue, practical ones, fearful ones. But before I could speak, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and something in his eyes went taut. You have to leave, he said abruptly. What? He stood, sweeping the folder into his bag. 2 men just came in the back. They're not here for coffee. I twisted in my seat. Through the reflection in the rain-slick window, I glimpsed them broad-shouldered shapes moving past the restrooms. Out. The kitchen, Red murmured. Don't look back. I didn't ask questions. I shoved out of the booth and pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen. A line cook glanced up, startled, but I ignored him and kept going, my heart hammering. The alley behind the diner was slick with rain. I ducked behind a dumpster, fighting to slow my breathing. Through a crack in the door, I saw Reed, still seated, calmly folding his hands on the table as the two men approached. One leaned in to speak. Reed didn't flinch. I couldn't hear a word, but the posture told the story. They were there to make sure he didn't say anything else. I couldn't stay. I crept along the alley until I reached the street, then turned and walked fast, head down, every muscle tight. I didn't look back. I drove west until the city gave way to dark fields and two-lane roads. My mind was a tangle of fear and guilt and something harder to name. It was almost dawn when my phone rang a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, then answered. "Don't speak," Ortiz's voice said. "Listen, you're compromised. They tracked you to the meeting." I closed my eyes. "I know, you have to move." "Do you have the folder?" "No." Reed kept it. A pause. He knew they'd come. "That's why he had you read it there." "What about him?" "He knew the risks." Her tone softened. "You can't save everyone." I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. "I need something concrete, something I can show. The public, documents, video, anything." "There's another lead," she said. "A satellite archive in Zurich. They store backups of the exoplanet spectra, the raw data your sister's team analyzed before it was scrubbed. Coordinates. I'm sending them now. But understand, if you take this, you're committed." I almost laughed, but it came out like a ragged breath. I was committed the moment I heard the signal. "Then God help us both," she whispered. The line went dead. I pulled off onto the shoulder and sat there as the first light broke across the fields. My thoughts drifted to my sister, her tired smile, the excitement in her voice whenever she spoke about her work. She didn't know any of this. She was still out there fighting for a truth she didn't realize had been caged. And somewhere, the people who'd built that cage were already tightening it around me. I opened the text from Ortiz. The coordinates glowed on my screen. A cold invitation. I felt the weight of it settle in my chest. The understanding that there would be no turning back. I started the engine. If they wanted the world to stay blind, they'd have to silence me first, and I wasn't planning to make that easy. I crossed into Germany the next evening under a false name. The Zurich archive would have to wait. Ortiz insisted there was something more urgent to contact. She called simply the Mole. I knew nothing about them except that they operated inside a darknet cell known as Echo, and they claimed to have proof that the prime number transmissions hadn't stopped. I'd spent most of the night in a cramped hostel room in Hamburg, staring at the ceiling, trying to decide if I was being led into a trap. I thought about Lowell's face in the firelight, about Reed's resigned expression as the two men approached his booth, and about the voices on the recording they're watching. When dawn finally broke, I made my choice. If I was going to burn my life down, I might as well see what was on the other side of the smoke by dusk. I was standing in front of an unmarked concrete building in an industrial district outside Bremen. There was no sign, no lights, just a dented steel door with a fingerprint scanner. My contact instructions had been clear. Knock 3 times. Wait, then show your left palm. My hand trembled as I lifted it. Part of me wanted to turn around and disappear into the evening crowds, find a cheap flight to anywhere, change my name again. But the bigger part of me needed to know. I knocked. 3 precise raps. Silence. Then the lock clicked. The door opened a few inches, spilling out a rectangle of pale blue light. A gloved hand beckoned me in. I stepped over the threshold, and the door sealed shut behind me with a hiss. Inside, the space looked nothing like I'd expected. It was clean, almost surgical rows of desks with laptops and cables, screens mounted on every wall, each one displaying blocks of code or live packet captures. The air smelled of ozone and stale coffee. A woman stood near the largest terminal. She couldn't have been more than 30, but her eyes were tired in a way I recognized too well. She wore dark jeans and a plain sweater, her hair pulled into a tight knot. "You're late," she said softly, in English. Her accent was hard to place. "Sit." I lowered myself onto a metal stool. My voice felt thin. "You're the mole." Her mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I'm just the translator." She gestured to the screens. "Echo is everyone, or no one, depending on how you look at it." I didn't respond. My gaze drifted to a wall of monitors showing a cascade of network traffic. Colored lines snaked across maps of Europe, blinking every time a connection spiked. She followed my look. "That's public Wi-Fi telemetry. Most of it's garbage streaming, encrypted chat. But sometimes," she stepped closer to a keyboard and tapped a key. "Sometimes we see this." The screens changed. Rows of spectral analyses filled the displays, wave forms plotted against time. In the middle of each graph, a series of identical peaks pulsed in perfect intervals. "Prime numbers," I whispered. She nodded. "The same pattern you heard in Green Bank. It's still being broadcast piggybacked on open networks." My skin prickled. How is that possible? If the lab was purged, if the tapes were destroyed, her gaze didn't waver. "You think a signal like this would stop because someone told it to? If anything, it's more active now." She clicked through a series of folders on her terminal. Each contained packet captures labeled with dates and times. 16 countries, she said. Every major ISP, every city with high-density Wi-Fi. It's everywhere. I felt my pulse thudding in my ears. I wanted to ask what it meant, why the signal had shifted to public networks, but before I could form the question, the lights flickered. Her eyes snapped to a small monitor mounted near the ceiling. A red status bar was crawling across it. "Flood. Suppression," she breathed. "What?" She didn't answer. She moved fast, slamming a fist into a concealed switch near the floor. All at once, the overhead sprinklers erupted, drenching everything in cold water. Sparks snapped across the server racks. The screens went black. "Move," she shouted. I scrambled to my feet as she hauled open a side door. We stumbled into a dark corridor, water pooling around our ankles. She slammed the door behind us and braced her shoulders against it. Through the wall, I heard a steady roar, the servers collapsing under the flood. Her voice was tight. "They found the relay. We have maybe 90 seconds. My thoughts spiraled. How does it matter? She snapped. "They always find it. That's what they do." A dim security light flickered to life in the hallway. I caught a glimpse of a camera mounted near the ceiling. Its lens cracked. She pulled a small flash drive from her pocket and pressed it into my palm. "Everything I have: packet logs, decryption, routines, contact lists. If they get me, you have to keep it moving." I closed my fingers around the drive. "What about you?" She took a shaky breath. "I'm not as valuable as this." Somewhere behind us, metal screeched like a crowbar, prying through a door. She pointed to the end of the corridor. "Out that way." "Don't look back." Her eyes locked onto mine, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Regret, go. I ran. I sprinted through the dark hall, my shoes slapping against the wet concrete. The exit door ahead was propped open, just enough to spill a slice of night onto the floor. I pushed into the alley beyond and didn't stop moving. I didn't allow myself to wonder if she'd make it out. At the end of the block, I doubled back behind a row of recycling bins. My breath came in ragged gasps. I listened. For a moment, there was only the hiss of rain on the pavement. Then, from somewhere inside the building, a voice cut through the darkness, a man's voice, amplified by a radio. Badge prefix Bravo 7, confirmed. The blood drained from my face. I knew that badge prefix. It belonged to the security detail that had vanished with Blake's research team a year earlier. I forced myself to keep moving. I didn't stop until I reached the train station an hour later. I sat on a bench in the terminal, soaked and shaking. The flash drive felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I thought about the mall, how calm she'd been, how ready to burn everything rather than let it fall into the wrong hands. I wondered if I had that in me. I thought about the badge prefix, again Bravo 7, and what it meant. Whoever was behind this had resources far beyond any corporation or agency. They weren't just protecting an economic secret. They were protecting something older, something buried so deep that even now the world still refused to see it. I reached for my phone and typed a single message to Ortiz. They're using public networks to spread the signal. I have the logs. The badge was Bravo 7. What does that mean? She replied almost instantly. Meet me in Zurich. Don't trust anyone. We'll talk there. I stared at the screen, feeling the exhaustion settle into my bones. I'd wanted to believe. There were limits lines that couldn't be crossed. But now I knew the truth. There were no lines, only deeper shadows. I closed my eyes, pressing the drive against my chest. And for the first time since this started, I knew I wasn't going to walk away. It took me 2 days to cross Europe. By the time I reached Siberia, my body felt hollow, running on black coffee and adrenaline. I hadn't slept more than an hour at a time. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman in the underground lab, her face tense as the servers died. Around her, Ortiz's last message had been blunt. If you want proof, no one can erase. You need to see what's under the ice. She sent me coordinates near the Loptev Sea. A private dig site, she said, funded through layers of front companies. She wouldn't say what I'd find there, only that it was alive. I flew into Yakutsk under an alias and took a cargo helicopter north. The pilot never spoke. He just studied me with the flat gaze of someone used to ferrying people who asked no questions. We landed on a frozen plateau around midnight. A small collection of prefabricated huts and a drilling rig stood against the wind, lit by floodlights that flickered in the dark. I climbed down, and the cold hit me so hard my breath caught. -30, maybe worse. I pulled my hood tight and forced myself to cross the clearing. A woman stepped out of the main hut as I approached. She wore a heavy parka, goggles over her eyes, a rifle slung across her back. "You're late," she called, her voice muffled. I stopped in front of her. "You Ortiz's contact?" She nodded. "Call me Mara. I'm here to show you the cause before the buyers come to clean up." "Buyers?" She didn't answer. She turned and motioned for me to follow. Inside, the main hut smelled of diesel and old canvas. A line of insulated crates ran along one wall. each labeled with barcodes and hand-scrawled numbers. Mara lifted the lid of the nearest crate, revealing a cylinder of clear ice the width of my forearm. Embedded in the frozen core were dozens of pale structures, delicate, branching forms like coral. I crouched, my breath fogging the surface. Under the UV lamp bolted to the ceiling, the structures glowed a dim blue. "What is it?" I asked. "Silicrules," Mara said. "Self-assembling silicon matrices. They grow in lattice formations, almost crystalline." She hesitated. "And they respond to electromagnetic fields." I looked up at her, meaning if you pulse them with the right frequency, they move. I swallowed. "Has anyone tested that?" She nodded. "We ran a low M-scan. The formations shifted in sync like they were aligning to something." I tried to imagine it. Silicon life, hidden under a mile of ice, waiting for a signal none of us understood. Mara closed the crate. "There are 6 cores. The buyers only want 1. Who are they?" She met my gaze evenly. "Does it matter? If they get this out, it disappears, like everything else." I felt that cold certainty, again the one that had haunted me since Green Bank. If I walked away, this would be buried. I straightened. "Then we make sure they don't get it." She lifted her chin slightly, as if measuring me. "Follow me." We stepped back into the wind. Snow drifted across the floodlit clearing. Beyond the rig, the land fell away into a dark slope where old drill holes pocked the ice. She led me to the last hut, unlocked the door, and switched on a single work lamp. A battered laptop sat on a folding table beside an insulated sample bag. "This is the field log," she said, nodding at the laptop. "Dates, sample tags, M recordings, all of it." I flipped it open. The screen glowed with a list of entries, strings of numbers, locations, timestamps. At the bottom, a final note caught my eye. 9:17 full response to composite signal. Immediate shutdown recommended. I read it again, heart thumping. What composite signal? Test pattern, she said quietly. Same primes you've been chasing. The pieces clicked into place. Whoever was transmitting the sequence had known exactly how to wake whatever lay below the ice. I looked up. This proves it. We can't let them erase this. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. They're coming tonight. How many? Enough. I didn't have time to think. I opened the sample bag and slipped the drive and Mara's field log inside. We'll split up if one of us gets caught. She didn't argue. She zipped the bag closed, handed it to me. Use the drill hole near the south slope. There's a shaped charge in the equipment shed. I stared at her. You planned this. I planned not to die in this place, she said evenly. I almost laughed. My breath came out in a thin white cloud. Footsteps crunched outside. Headlamps bobbed. In the darkness beyond the clearing, I looked at Mara. Good luck, you too. Then she slipped out the back door. I moved fast, skirting the edge of the clearing. The wind knifed through my parka as I ran to the shed. Inside, I found the charge no bigger than a loaf of bread and a coil of detonation cord. My hands shook as I tucked it under my arm. The footsteps were closer now. Voices rose, muffled by the storm. I sprinted toward the south slope. The ice crust cracked under my boots. I dropped to my knees by an old drill hole and set the charge inside. I pulled the primer wire tight, thumbed the ignition switch. Behind me, beams of light swung across the snow. Stop, someone shouted. I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and turned, raising a hand to shield my eyes. At least 3 figures advanced, their rifles aimed at my chest. One of them stepped closer, hand over the samples. I took a slow step back. My heel touched the det cord. "You don't want to do this," he said evenly. He was right. I didn't, but I wasn't here to walk away. I triggered the charge. The explosion was sharp and immediate. Ice shattered upward in a cloud of white shards, blinding everyone. I turned and ran, my vision swimming. The slope dropped away beneath me, and I stumbled into darkness. I slid, boots skidding over fractured ice. My shoulder hit a ridge, and pain shot down my arm. But I didn't stop. I kept moving until the gunfire behind me faded into the storm. When I finally collapsed behind a ridge of broken ice, I pressed a hand to my ribs. My pulse hammered in my throat. Somewhere above, the Black Ops team would be regrouping. They'd search every drift until they were sure I was gone. I reached into my coat and felt the insulated bag still tucked against my chest. Proof. I let out a shaky breath. I was tired, more tired than I'd ever been. But when I looked up, the sky was clear above me, the stars cold and sharp as glass. And for the first time, I felt something almost like hope. I didn't stop running until the glow of the dig site was a pale bruise on the horizon behind me. I made my way south across the ice, moving from ridge to stay hidden from any thermal drones. Each hour I expected to hear the thrum of helicopters or the crack of a rifle. But the darkness stayed quiet, holding its breath at dawn. I reached the outskirts of a settlement 3, metal sheds, and a supply depot, where an old transport pilot waited with a battered plane. I never asked who paid him. He never asked why my clothes were crusted with frost and blood. He just nodded for me to climb in. 3 days later, I crossed into Switzerland on forged papers and a headache so deep it felt like it was drilled into my skull. The silacral samples and the field logs were zipped in a vacuum bag under my coat. I knew I couldn't keep them long. Someone would be tracking them. Zurich felt too clean, too bright, like a stage set waiting for the actors to return. I rented a cabin in the mountains, a narrow wooden house built into a slope above a dry creek bed. Ortiz called it a refuge, though I doubted any place could stay safe for long. The night I arrived, I unpacked the flash drives and samples onto a scarred desk. I locked the door, pulled the heavy curtains, and finally let myself exhale. Then I powered up the laptop and slotted in the prog drive. I'd almost forgotten about it. Ortiz had pressed it into my hand weeks earlier, just before she vanished again. "Decrypt this when you're ready," she'd said. "It will change everything." I'd thought it was a bluff, a way to keep me moving. But as the drive booted, a single folder appeared on the screen. Signal_2_sound translator V1. 3. My mouth went dry. I opened the folder. Inside were schematics, hundreds of pages of diagrams, circuit designs, and annotated notes. Each page described a machine that could convert the raw prime number signals into an audible pattern, something the human ear could process. It was more than proof. It was a blueprint for making contact. I flipped through the pages in silence. The components were listed in meticulous detail: frequency modulators, micro-resonant coils, biometric monitors. Many were standard lab gear, but a few were tagged as proprietary defense. PROTOTYP, E's marked with serial numbers and clearance levels far above anything I'd ever seen. Halfway through the schematics, I found a line of binary code scrawled in the margin. No explanation, no context, just the string repeated again and again. I copied it into a decoder and watched the text resolve. Word by word, we invited them in. I sat back, my heart hammering, not discovered, not intercepted. Invited, a sick feeling rose in my throat. My thoughts reeled back to the Silicrals, how they had responded to the composite signal. Someone knew this transmission wasn't just noise. Someone had built a translator years ago and tried to make contact. I thought of the Harvard lab, of the woman's last recording they're watching. I understood, finally, what she'd meant. This wasn't a warning about detection. It was a warning about what had already happened. I leaned forward, fingers trembling, and tried to search the files for more context. But every reference to the translator's first test had been blacked out whole sections, replaced with error codes and missing file markers. I shut the laptop and pressed the heels of my palms to my eyes. I wanted to believe there was still a chance to walk away. But that hope had died somewhere in Siberia, buried under a mile of ice and a handful of silicon fossils. I pulled the sample bag onto my lap. The silicral cores glowed faintly under the UV lamp, a soft, pulsing blue. They looked delicate, harmless, but I couldn't stop thinking of them as something waiting. My phone buzzed. A text from Ortiz. "Do you have it?" I typed back with stiff fingers. "I have everything. The translator plans, the cores, the logs. But the test records are gone." 3 dots pulsed. Then her reply came. "Then there, ahead of us. We need to know who signed off on the original prototype. I'll trace the serial numbers. Sit tight." I wanted to ask her how she kept moving, how she didn't freeze under the weight of all this. But I knew the answer. The only way to survive was to stay in motion. I set the phone aside. There was one more thing I hadn't checked. I reached into the pocket of my jacket and pulled out the small card reader I'd taken from the ice rig. I hadn't dared to look at the contents during my escape. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I plugged it into the laptop. A single file appeared. No title, no metadata. I opened it, the screen filled with a scan of a typed memo, dated 7 years. Earlier, the letterhead was Defense Intelligence, though most of the heading was blacked out. To all operatives assigned to Project Phoenix, in the event of partial containment failure, initiate retrieval of all signal-to-sound components and secure them in Vault Sigma. Under no circumstances, allow prototype assembly to be completed without central authorization. Any unauthorized activation is to be treated as an existential breach. Existential breach. I read the words again and again. My eyes drifted to the desk where the silicral samples pulsed under the lamp, to the translator plans spread in a fan of thin paper. The pieces clicked into place in a way that made my skin crawl. They hadn't just buried this research to avoid panic. They'd buried it because someone had tried to finish the machine. Something had answered, and now most of the prototype was gone. I thought of the components marked proprietary defense. If they were missing from the vault, someone else had them. Someone who might be trying to reassemble the device as I sat here, wondering what to do. I shut the laptop and let my head fall forward. For a long time, I stayed that way, trying to calm the rush of dread in my chest. Then I stood, walked to the narrow window, and looked out over the valley. Snow drifted under the moonlight. A line of fresh tracks led up the slope toward my cabin, too recent to be from me, too clean to be animal. I swallowed. I turned off the lamp, gathered the silicral bag and the drives, and moved to the back door. If they were coming, I wouldn't be here to greet them. I slipped into the dark, the the snow crunching under my boots. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, a single vibration I didn't dare stop to check. I knew what it would say. They're moving faster than we thought. I kept going, because there was nothing else left to do. The next morning, I left the mountains behind. I drove through the Swiss valleys until the landscape blurred into dull fields and silent villages. My thoughts wouldn't settle. Every time I blinked, I saw the phrase existential breach stamped across the memo I'd found. Ortiz called once, her voice thin with fatigue. They'll be watching every airport, she said. You need to move through ground transport as long as you can. Where am I going? I asked. To Paris. Dr. Reyes is scheduled to present her research tomorrow. If the defense consortium doesn't shut her down first. What's her connection? She spent 5 years modeling planetary collapse. Her data overlaps with the same exoplanet signals you pulled from Harvard. I gripped the wheel tighter. So if she's right, we're not just looking at a cover-up. We're looking at a controlled collapse, Ortiz said. Then she hung up. By the time I reached the outskirts of Paris, night had fallen. I parked the car under a stand of bare trees and changed into clean clothes. I needed to look like someone who belonged at a research symposium, not a fugitive carrying stolen lab samples. The building was an old courthouse converted into an academic hall. I slipped in through a side door and found a seat in the back row. On stage, Dr. Reyes stood behind a polished podium, her face pale under the lights. She looked exhausted but steady. A projection screen behind her showed a scatterplot of atmospheric readings, methane spikes, oxygen deficits, the kind of evidence only a planetary scientist could interpret with confidence. Her voice was low, but clear. Over the last decade, we have modeled multiple collapse scenarios, she said. Each shows a window of habitability closing faster than previous estimates. A man in the front row shifted uncomfortably. I recognized him. He worked for one of the aerospace think tanks tied to the Phoenix Consortium. Reyes continued, "We accept that life beyond Earth is possible. We must also accept the likelihood that most civilizations never survive long enough to communicate." She paused, her gaze steady on the audience. "That's the Guyan bottleneck." A murmur rippled across the room. Someone coughed. I felt my chest tighten, because I'd read the memos. I knew the consortium had spent millions funding projects designed to prove the opposite, that life was rare, Earth was unique, and any suggestion otherwise should be buried. Reyes clicked to the next slide. A table of comparative biosignatures. K218b was there. So were 3 other exoplanets I'd seen in the data from Harvard. She was about to cross the line from theory into proof, and I knew what would happen next. I slipped out of my seat and moved to the aisle. My instincts were screaming to get to her, to warn her somehow. But before I could take another step, the doors at the back of the hall burst open. 3 men in dark tactical jackets strode in, hands tucked under their coats. Their eyes scanned the rows, calm and deliberate. Someone near me gasped. Reyes looked up. Her hand hovered over the podium, her mouth half open. The man in the center raised a small device. He pressed it once. Every screen in the hall flickered. 2 black. The lights died. For a heartbeat, there was silence, then chaos. People shouted and surged to their feet. Chairs scraped the floor. I ducked low and slipped between 2 rows, moving fast toward the stage. Emergency lights clicked on, casting the room in a red glow. One of the men vaulted onto the platform. He pulled Reyes roughly away from the podium. Papers scattered across the floor. I reached the edge of the stage just as another man swept a handheld scanner over the equipment. He seemed to know exactly what he was looking for. I crawled onto the stage from the side, keeping my body low behind a stack of folded screens. My heart was thudding so hard I thought it would give me away. When I peeked over the edge, I saw Reyes, pinned against the lectern. She looked dazed, one hand pressed to her temple where they'd struck her. The man holding her leaned in and spoke too quietly for me to hear. Then he ripped something from the inside pocket of her blazer, folded sheet of paper, creased from being carried for days. He tucked it into his jacket. I didn't have time to think. I reached for the nearest microphone cable, yanked it free, and flung it across the floor. The metal connector clanged against the tiles. Every head turned. I bolted. I vaulted off the back of the stage and hit the floor hard enough to jar my spine. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted toward the far exit. Behind me, I heard Reyes shout, "Just one sand." The sound stuck in my chest like a blade. Crashed through the door into a service hallway lined with supply closets. My breath came in ragged bursts. I couldn't go back, but I couldn't leave without something. I turned into the last doorway before the stairwell. It was a small office, just big enough for a desk and a filing cabinet. I flipped the light on and forced myself to focus. On the desk sat a battered laptop, its lid open. The screen showed an email draft addressed to the journal that had agreed to publish Reyes's paper. Attached was a PDF dot. I recognized the file name Bottleneck Manuscript Final. I slipped the USB drive from my pocket and plugged it in. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I copied the file and pulled the drive free. I didn't let myself look at the rest of the desktop. Whatever else Reyes had written, I couldn't save it all. I killed the light and slipped into the stairwell. Climbed down 2 flights, listening for footsteps. The building felt hollow, echoing with the panic still unfolding upstairs. At the exit, I pressed my back to the door and forced myself to breathe. When I pushed it open, the night was calm. A street lamp flickered over the courtyard. I stepped into the cold and walked quickly toward the side gate. Before I reached it, my phone buzzed. Ortiz's voice was flat in my ear. "Did you get it?" "Yes," I whispered. "But they took her." "She knew the risk," Ortiz said quietly. "Upload the paper as soon as you can." I swallowed. "What will it change?" "It will prove they're lying. Even if it's only for a moment." I looked back at the building. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw movement. In one of the upper windows, a silhouette watching the courtyard. I turned away. I kept walking, each step heavier than the last, because I knew this was only the beginning. I'd been asleep for less than an hour when the call came. My phone buzzed across the motel nightstand, skittering against the cracked wood. At first, I thought it was Ortiz again, ready with another set of coordinates or another name I'd never heard. But when I squinted at the caller ID, my heart lurched. Megan Clark. I hadn't spoken to her in 2 years. Back then, she'd been an analyst buried deep inside the European Space Agency's archives program. She'd always seemed cautious, smart enough to see the edges of the conspiracy, too scared to step over the line. I pressed accept and sat up, already bracing for whatever had made her break her silence. "Megan," my voice cracked. She didn't answer at first. I heard only static and what sounded like her ragged breathing. Then, very faintly, she spoke. "They hijacked the sequence." I felt cold all over. "What do you mean?" She took a shuddering breath. "They're not just jamming the signal anymore. They're inserting commands, embedded instructions. Instructions for what? Her voice dropped to a whisper. Resonance events. Patterns that trigger responses in the lattice samples. The cerebral cause. I swung my feet to the floor, heart hammering. Where are you, D. Nevada? She broke off. I heard a muffled shout in the background, and something crashed hard against a wall. Megan, listen to me, I said. If you have data, send it now. Send everything. She made a small, choked sound. They're here. Static surged. I gripped the phone tighter. Don't hang up. But her voice was barely a thread. You have to finish it, she whispered. A loud bang cut her off. Then silence. The call disconnected. I stared at the screen, my pulse racing. It was 3:14 a.m. I'd never felt so helpless. For a long moment, I sat frozen on the edge of the bed, the phone still pressed to my ear. My mind was already trying to rationalize what I'd heard, convince me it had been a mistake, a prank, anything other than the obvious. But deep down, I knew Clark was gone. I forced myself to move. My laptop was still propped open on the chipped desk. I connected to a secure server and tried to trace the last ping from her number. The metadata was minimal. Whoever she called from knew how to strip a signal. But I could see one clue in the routing logs. UT-17, Annex, Nevada. I recognized the code. It was a decommissioned communications hub, supposedly mothballed after the Cold War. But rumors had always swirled around it. Some said the Annex was where prototype jamming hardware had been tested. Others claimed it was a dumping ground for classified archives no one could risk destroying. I didn't let myself overthink. By sunrise, I was on the road, driving west in a rented panel van that still smelled like paint thinner. The drive blurred into hours of cracked highways and rest-stop coffee. The closer I got to Nevada, the emptier the landscape felt, just brittle grass and broken fences and that huge, unending sky. By the time I reached the outskirts of the Annex, it was near dusk. I pulled off the road and studied the compound through binoculars. It looked abandoned. A line of chain-link fence circled the property. A handful of low concrete buildings sagged behind it, their windows dark. I didn't trust appearances anymore. I waited until the sun slipped behind the hills, then crept along the perimeter until I found a section of fence that had been cut and twisted back. Someone else had come through here before me. Inside the fence, the air smelled like old wiring and dust. My boots crunched on patches of gravel and dry weeds. I made straight for the largest building, the main server hall. The door was locked, but the frame had been pried away near the latch. I slipped inside. The darkness was thick and absolute. I turned on my flashlight and swept the beam across the room. Rows of metal racks stretched out, most empty or charred. Some still held the blackened husks of servers, their housings warped by fire. Whatever had happened here hadn't been an accident. I moved deeper into the hall, careful not to trip over fallen cables. The air felt hot, almost chemical. Near the far wall, I saw something that made me stop short. A single server unit stood intact, its casing scuffed but not burned, and resting on top of it was a small portable drive. It was labeled in black. Marker, Clark Final. Sequence. I reached for it with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking when my fingers closed around the drive. The hairs on my neck stood up. I turned, half expecting to see someone in the doorway, but there was only darkness and the quiet hiss of cooling metal. I forced myself to breathe. If Clark had died for anything, it was this. I slipped the drive into my jacket, I knew I should leave. But something made me look around the server one last time. Taped to the front panel was a folded sheet of paper. I pulled it free and flipped it open. It was a handwritten note. Echo, signal, last 7 seconds. They'll deny everything. Keep listening. No. Signature. But I didn't need one. I backed away, my heart in my throat. I didn't know if I was carrying proof of what Clark had found, or bait meant to draw me out. But it didn't matter. Either way, I had no choice but to keep moving. Outside, the night had turned cold. I followed the fence line back to the van, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the driver's seat, I took a moment to steady my hands before I started the engine. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't want to look, but I did. Ortiz had sent me a single line of text. If you have Clark's recording, you need to get it to me. They're already rewriting the logs. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Then I looked out at the darkness beyond the windshield. I thought of Clark's voice, thin and frightened, and the way it had cut off mid-sentence. I didn't know what the recording held, but I knew I wouldn't let it disappear. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the van with the engine off, watching the edge of the desert fade into a pale dawn. The air smelled like dust and old plastic. I kept replaying Clark's final words in my mind, trying to imagine what she'd heard in those last 7 seconds. When the sun was fully up, I turned the ignition and drove east until I found a diner with spotty cell service. I parked behind the building, plugged the drive into my laptop, and started copying the files. My hands were so cold they felt numb. The drive held one audio clip. It was labeled simply echo_sequence.wav. I didn't dare play it there. If it was rigged with any kind of tracer, I'd already made myself a target by accessing it at all. But I had to know what Clark had died for. I packed everything up and pulled out onto the road, my mind already calculating the next steps. Ortiz had told me once, if you ever need leverage, file a FOIA suit. Make it public. Make them scramble to explain themselves. At the time, I'd laughed it off. But now, sitting behind the wheel, I knew she'd been serious. I crossed into California by evening and checked into a cheap motel near Sacramento. The room was stale and windowless. A single desk lamp flickered over the cracked wallpaper. I pulled out the laptop and started drafting a complaint. I didn't know if it would work, but I needed a way to force their hand to whom it may concern. Under the Freedom of Information Act, I am requesting immediate disclosure of all records, communications, and internal directives pertaining to the project codenamed Silent Dawn, including, but not limited to, any operational plans involving transmission suppression, signal containment, and atmospheric masking systems. I read it back twice, my pulse racing. Then I hit send. The next 3 weeks crawled by in a haze of bad coffee and sleepless nights. I moved every 48 hours, never staying in the same motel twice. Some nights I caught myself listening to the echo file, just the first few seconds of static before slamming the laptop shut. I was terrified that even hearing the recording might somehow tag me. I'd almost given up hope when the email finally arrived. Notification of document production. My chest tightened as I read the rest. They were releasing partial no doubt, but it was more than I'd expected. The pickup location was a Federal Records office in downtown Los Angeles. I left that night, driving straight through until the sun was high and the freeways were packed with cars. When I finally reached the building, my hands were trembling so badly I had to shove them into my pockets to look normal. A uniformed clerk met me at the security window, her expression neutral. She slid a clipboard toward me. "Sign here." My pen scratched across the form. She disappeared into the back, then returned with a thick binder sealed in a transparent evidence bag. "Here you go," I thanked her, and carried it outside as casually as I could. But the second I turned the corner, my composure cracked. I ducked into an alley and unzipped the bag. The cover sheet said, "Operation Silent Dawn Selected Records." My stomach clenched. I flipped past the first pages, mostly generic memos, stamped confidential. But halfway through, I hit a section labeled Annex Global Transmission Suppression Systems. I read slowly, forcing myself to take in every line. All facilities tasked with maintaining threshold silence on frequency bands exceeding the pre-designated resonance index. Automated jamming installations positioned at known observatories and private arrays. Operational directive authorizes immediate suppression of any unauthorized attempt to broadcast or receive frequencies beyond protocol parameters. I swallowed. They hadn't just been listening, they'd been actively jamming any attempt to reply. My hands were slick with sweat. I turned the page and found a schematic array of ground-based transmitters, each one aimed skyward. Below it was a single handwritten annotation: "Silence protocol equals wartime. Contingency wartime." I leaned against the brick wall and closed my eyes. They weren't afraid of panic or bad press. They were acting like this was an invasion. I kept reading. At the end of the annex, there was a short list of authorized operators, dozens of names, most redacted. But one line stood out: Primary Liaison, J. Blake. My heart stopped. Blake had disappeared. With his team 2 years ago, everyone assumed he'd defected or been killed. But here was his name, connected to the same system that had been silencing the signals since the start. I wondered what he'd seen that convinced him to join them, or if he'd had any choice. I tucked the binder under my arm and stepped back onto the sidewalk. My mind felt raw, scraped clean of any illusions I'd been clinging to. This wasn't about controlling information anymore. It was about controlling reality itself, deciding what humanity was allowed to know about what waited beyond our atmosphere. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Ortiz. "Did you get the documents?" "Yes," I typed. "It's worse than we thought. They're jamming everything. Blake is involved." 3 dots flickered. Then her reply came. "Meet me in the desert. I have something you need to hear." I wanted to ask what she meant, but I knew she wouldn't answer over a text. I started walking back toward the van. The binder clutched tight against my chest. I tried to tell myself I was ready for whatever came next, but as I crossed the street, I caught my reflection in a shop window. I looked like someone I didn't recognize, and deep down, I wasn't sure if that was a good thing. The drive from Los Angeles to the Nevada border felt longer than any road I'd ever taken. I kept the radio off. I didn't want music or news. I needed to think. Ortiz had told me to meet her in a small rental office on the edge of a dry lake bed. She said she had proof that the silence protocol wasn't just about stopping signals. It was about rewriting them. By the time I arrived, the sun was low and the wind was picking up dust across the flats. I parked behind the building and scanned the horizon, half expecting to see a black SUV waiting. But the lot was empty. I unlocked the side door and stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like old carpet and cheap coffee. Ortiz sat at a folding table under a flickering fluorescent bulb. She didn't look up when I walked in. She was hunched over a laptop, her hair loose around her face. When she finally lifted her eyes to meet mine, I saw something there I hadn't before, something close to defeat. "You look terrible," she said quietly. I almost laughed. I could say the same about you. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit, we don't have much time." I pulled the binder from my bag and set it down. "I have the NX, the schematic. They're jamming every channel above a threshold. It's all in here." Her gaze flicked over the documents. "That's only half of it." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She turned the laptop so I could see the screen. A graph glowed in the dim light, spectral lines dancing across a black background. "K218b, she said. "Raw spectra." I got the files from a lab tech at the web archive who still owed me a favor. I leaned closer. "This is the planet they called ambiguous." "Right," she said. "Ambiguous. Because oxygen and methane at those concentrations shouldn't coexist naturally." My chest tightened. She tapped a key. A second graph appeared, overlaid in red. "This is the cleaned version, the one they released to the public. They scrubbed the signal, flattened the peaks, and called it sensor error." I swallowed. Why? Why hide it now? "Because if they admit life exists elsewhere," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "the entire rare earth narrative collapses. And if the public believes in contact, they'll start asking why we haven't replied." I sat back in my chair, feeling sick. "Have you told anyone else?" I asked. She shook her head. "No. You're the only one I trust not to fold the second someone in a suit knocks on your door." I didn't know if that was a compliment or a warning. I reached for the keyboard. "Let me see the raw data." She slid the laptop closer, paged through the spectra, line by line, until I saw it. A cluster of emission spikes grouped into repeating intervals. 3, 5, 7, 11, prime. Numbers. My hand tightened on the edge of the table. "It's the same pattern." Ortiz nodded. "I think the silence protocol was never about jamming alien broadcasts. It was about covering up the fact that someone, maybe even us, invited them." The thought settled in my gut like a stone. I looked at her. "If we release this, they'll come for us." She met my gaze. "They already are." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "I need you to help me publish the analysis. Not through the journals, they're compromised. We'll put it in the hands of citizen scientists. Let them verify it. Once it's out there, they can't erase it." I nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" "Draft the release," she said. "Compile the data. And when you're done, get as far away from here as you can." I pulled my own laptop from my bag and set it up next to hers. My fingers felt clumsy as I typed. I kept thinking about Clark, about Dr. Reyes, about all the people who had tried to lift the curtain and how quickly they had vanished. Every few minutes, I looked up to see if Ortiz was still there, if she'd bolt the second I stopped watching her. But she stayed, hour after hour. We worked side by side in that dusty little room at 4 in the morning. I hit publish. We pushed the analysis to every major citizen science server, every independent astrophysics forum, every dark web archive. For a moment, I let myself breathe. "Now we wait," Ortiz said softly. But it didn't take long. By dawn, the counter on the main mirror site was climbing by thousands. Comments poured in, some excited, some skeptical, some already accusing us of forgery. I was about to reply to a question when the servers began to slow. Then the first error messages appeared. Distributed denial. Ortiz muttered. There. Flooding it, I checked the logs. A wave of bot traffic was hammering the sites, injecting thousands of junk comments, crashing the servers under the load. I felt something break in my chest. They were ready for this, I said. She reached across the table and took my hand. It doesn't matter. It's out. Even if they bury it, someone saw it. But her eyes were tired, and I could tell she wasn't sure she believed it. I closed the laptop and stood. My legs were unsteady. We need to leave, I said. They'll trace the upload. She didn't argue. We packed everything in silence. At the door, she paused. If we split up, you'll have a better chance. I looked at her, realizing I might never see her again. I'll find you, I said. She almost smiled. I know. Then she slipped out into the dawn. I stood there for a moment, listening to the wind in that brief, empty quiet. I realized the truth. No matter how far I ran, the signal would follow, because it wasn't just data anymore. It was a promise. And someone out there was still waiting for an answer. I didn't sleep after Ortiz sent me the coordinates. My thoughts kept circling back to Blake's face in that warehouse photo and the note scrawled across the bottom: Warsaw, 2016. She was there by dawn. I'd decided I needed to see him in person. No more whispers. No more relayed threats. David, my old contact in corporate security, agreed to meet me at a truck stop north of Houston. He looked older than I remembered, his hair thinner, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. He didn't bother with pleasantries. You're out of your mind, he said, sliding a manila folder across the sticky table. This is the guest list for tonight's gala. Every big donor, every contractor, every KEMR board member. I flipped through the list. My stomach clenched when I saw Blake's name near the top. I need inside, I said. David rubbed a hand over his face. You don't just walk into these events. They'll scan badges, log identities, check face matches. On entry, if you show up without prep, they'll know. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. But there's a workaround. 2 hours before the gala, the caterers bring in temp staff. I can get you a uniform and a badge that'll scan clean for about 15 minutes. I swallowed. 15 minutes is enough. He studied me for a long time, as if searching for the version of me who wouldn't have been willing to do this. Don't get caught, he finally said. At dusk, I changed into a black catering jacket in the back of David's van. He handed me a forged staff. The laminate was warm from the printer. This isn't perfect, he warned. If they run a deep check, you're done. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. The Houston Tower was all glass and steel, its lobby lit in warm gold. I slipped in behind a group of servers wheeling carts of hors d'oeuvres. My badge beeped green at the checkpoint, and the guard barely glanced at me inside. The ballroom was even more opulent than I'd imagined. Crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, hundreds of people in evening gowns and tailored suits. I kept my head down, carrying a tray of glasses. 10 minutes. That's all I had. I circled the edge of the crowd, searching faces. My pulse jumped when I spotted Blake near the central bar, no mask, talking to a woman I didn't recognize. I edged closer, pretending to top off champagne flutes. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I forced myself to listen. Time are moving ahead, Blake was saying. We won't get another window after this quarter. The woman frowned. If the files leak, Blake cut her off. Then we pin it on the contractors. The narrative holds. I felt cold. A waiter brushed past me, jolting my arm. My badge spun around, the barcode visible. Blake's gaze shifted. For a split second, his eyes locked on mine. Recognition flickered by my chest clenched. I turned fast, weaving through the crowd. I could feel him following, his voice rising behind me. "Hey!" I ducked into a service corridor, heart hammering. 2 security guards rounded the corner ahead, radios crackling. I slipped through an unmarked door, praying it wasn't alarmed. Inside was a dark office, the walls lined with file cabinets. I held my breath, listening for footsteps. When none came, I exhaled shakily. On the desk, a tablet glowed with an open document logistics schedules, line items for signal suppression infrastructure, invoices billed to KEMR subsidiaries. I snapped photos with my phone, my hands shaking. I didn't have time to read it all, but one note near the bottom made me go still. Silent Dawn, extension authorized. Prepare, phase transition. Phase transition. I didn't want to think about what that meant. In the hallway, a voice barked in order. Boots pounded past the door. I slipped out the back exit and into the loading bay. Cool night air hit my face. I kept walking, every nerve on fire, until I reached the street. Only then did I look back. Through a third-floor window, I saw Blake watching the crowd below, phone pressed to his ear. I knew without question he was calling in my description, but the photos were in my pocket. Proof that this wasn't about science or survival. It was business. And I was finished letting them dictate what stayed hidden. I didn't leave Houston right away. I parked under a freeway overpass, my phone in my lap, the photos from Blake's tablet glowing on the screen. Silent Dawn, extension authorized. Prepare, phase transition. I kept reading that line, wondering if it meant a new suppression campaign or something worse by sunrise. I knew where I had to go. Ortiz had once said, if everything else falls apart, go to the coordinates. If it's real, you'll see 4. Yourself. I didn't trust her anymore. Maybe I never had, but I was out of options. It took me a day and a half to cross the desert. When I pulled off the highway onto a rutted service road, my hands were slick with sweat. The place wasn't just a forgotten annex. Up close, I saw fresh tire tracks curling off the gravel. A steel perimeter fence had been repaired recently. New welds, new locks, whatever was buried here, someone was still watching it. I parked behind a rocky outcrop and loaded a spare battery into my radio scanner. If there were active patrols, I'd hear them first. The fence was too high to climb quietly. But about 50 yards down, I found a drainage culvert half covered with debris. I crawled inside, belly scraping damp concrete, and emerged behind a row of storage sheds. The air smelled like ozone and old machinery. A maintenance door stood ajar, propped open by a rock. That detail chilled me more than any locked gate. Someone else was already inside. I moved slowly through the dim hallway, the scanner tucked against my chest. The first chamber I passed was empty, just metal racks and bundled cables. But in the second, a faint blue glow seeped from under the door. I pushed it open an inch. A workstation flickered in the dark. A man sat slumped in a folding chair, headset still clamped over his ears. His face was turned away, but the way his body sagged made my stomach twist. I edged closer, one step at a time. The screen in front of him displayed a live waveform. 3, 5, 7, 11. I knew that pattern. It was the signal. My gaze shifted. to the far wall. A vault door dominated the room, taller than any I'd ever seen. A biometric reader blinked red beside it, waiting for input. Etched into the metal were the same spiral glyphs I'd seen in the Bremen logs. I swallowed hard. Admission costs more than you have, but this time there was something else painted. In hurried strokes across the bottom of the door, "This is not ours." I felt a prickle of dread run through me. I turned back to the workstation, searching for any clues. The man's radio crackled softly, picking up distant voices. "Sweep team, north. Access clear." They were coming. I slipped around the vault door to a recessed panel and tried to pry it open. My fingers found a small slot, barely big enough for a keycard. I had nothing to offer it, but when I pressed my palm against the reader, it pulsed once. A mechanical voice spoke, muffled by layers of steel. "Cognitive pattern incomplete. Admission." Denied. I stumbled back. For a second, I thought I heard something behind the door, a low, resonant hum, almost like breathing. Then silence. I forced myself to look again at the man in the chair. His headset cable had been severed, the ends charred. He'd died here waiting for an answer I wasn't going to get. I backed away, my pulse roaring in my ears. The radio crackled again. "East sector. Approaching vault." I ran outside. The night wind hit my face like a slap. I bolted for the fence, slipping between storage sheds. A searchlight swept across the gravel. I flattened behind a generator as footsteps approached. 2 men in tactical gear passed within 10 feet of me. Their visors glowed faint green. "Did you see it?" one murmured. "Doesn't matter," the other said. "No one comes out." I clenched my jaw to keep from making a sound. When they disappeared around the corner, I moved again. I reached the culvert and crawled through, every breath tight in my chest. By the time I stumbled back to the van, my shirt was soaked with sweat. I didn't start the engine right away. I sat there, hands on the wheel, staring at the dark facility. It hadn't just been a Cold War relic. It was an embassy, but not for us, and I was no closer to understanding why the door had refused me, or why it had spoken at all. I checked my phone. No messages. Ortiz had sent me here. Had she known what was waiting, or what would follow me out? I closed my eyes, fighting the urge to start driving and never stop. Instead, I pressed record on my phone. "This is for whoever finds this," I whispered. "There's something alive under the Nevada annex. It knows when you're near, and it doesn't want to open." I ended the recording and slipped the phone into my pocket. Then I turned the key and drove into the dark. I didn't leave Nevada right away. I spent the next 48 hours camped at a run-down motel 20 miles from the annex. My van parked under a broken security light. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice. Cognitive pattern incomplete. Admission denied. I kept wondering if the message was meant for me or someone who'd been here long before. I arrived. On the second morning, I woke to a text from Ortiz. CubeSat launch window confirmed. You have 3 days. 3 days, not hours. Part of me felt relief. The rest felt like dread. I knew the launch wouldn't be simple. Even piggybacking on a university rocket required paperwork, clearances, bribes. Ortiz must have been arranging it for months, maybe longer. A second message came a minute later. They'll expect you to run. Don't finish what you started. I didn't reply. Instead, I drove north, following a crumbling road past rusted billboards and a dead cotton field. The garage lab was exactly as I'd left it, dusty workbenches. Cables tangled across the floor. In the back, under a tarp, lay the cubes. I'd built it from scrap, never expecting it to fly, but now it felt like the last move I had. I spent a day stripping the old firmware, replacing it with a fresh install. I tested the antenna array until dawn, when my eyes felt like sandpaper. Each time I stopped, I heard the hum from behind the Nevada vault door, echoing in my thoughts. I kept reminding myself the signal hadn't come from there. Not only there, the wormhole readings proved that something was waiting beyond the solar system, something watching us in return. And if the silence protocol was designed to keep us deaf, maybe the CubeSat was my chance to listen without interference. On the morning of the launch, a black SUV rolled past the garage and slowed at the corner. My pulse thudded. I stood in the doorway, pretending to scroll my phone. After a minute, it drove on. I knew what it meant. They were closing in, but they hadn't stopped the launch. I loaded the CubeSat into the back of a rented van and drove east, across state lines, into Utah. At the University Aerospace Center, I met a logistics manager named Grant. He didn't ask for my real name. His eyes were wary, as if he'd helped too many people like me already. "The payment cleared," he said. "I'll get your payload into the integration schedule." I tried to sound calm. "How long until deployment?" "For days. Maybe 5. 5 days. Long enough to make me question everything." But when he handed me the clearance badge, I knew I wouldn't walk away. I stayed in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town each morning. I drove to the center and watched the technicians assemble. The rocket behind plexiglass. My CubeSat looked tiny compared to the other payloads. At night, I laid awake listening to the distant freight trains and wondering if I was about to hand over my last chance to people who would bury it. On the 4th day, Grant called. "Window opens tomorrow," he said. "You'll get a confirmation ping when separation occurs." I hung up without replying. I was too tired for small talk. Launch day, I stood in the observation bunker, hands jammed in my pockets. The rocket ignited at 14:07 local time, a roar so deep it felt like my ribs shook. When it cleared the pad, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. This time, the silence felt different, less oppressive, more like possibility. It took 2 weeks for the CubeSat to reach position past Neptune's orbit. I drove south to Arizona and rented a place so remote even the mail didn't come without a fight. Every morning, I checked the telemetry window. For 13 days, it was just normal readings, radiation, magnetic fields, background noise. On the 14th day, at 6:21 UTC, the signal changed. A spike so clean it looked artificial. My chest went tight. I loaded the data into the visualizer. The waveform bloomed into an arc curve I recognized from every speculative paper I'd ever read. A gravity lens, a wormhole signature. I sat back, staring at the screen. No jamming, no interference. For once, the silence protocol wasn't fast enough. I copied the logs to a secure drive, every motion deliberate. Then I connected the CubeSat's radio, switched to low power mode, and tried to hail the anomaly. Static. Then, abruptly, the telemetry froze. I tried a manual reset. My palms slick. Nothing, just a final ping in the log. "You're not ready." My breath caught. Someone or something had shut down the satellite. but not before letting me see. I closed the laptop and pressed my hands over my face. This wasn't suppression, it was a warning. I spent the next day driving nowhere in particular, just needing to feel motion under me. That night, I pulled over on a ridge above the desert. I sat on the hood of the van and watched the stars crawl west. I thought of the vault door in Nevada, the whisper through my recorder, the ark drifting past Neptune. None of them had denied. I was listening. They'd only told me I wasn't ready. I didn't know if I ever would be, but I knew I couldn't stop. When dawn came, I started the engine and turned south. If the silence protocol was going to erase this, they'd have to catch me first. I didn't go south right away. Instead, I hid out in a shuttered campground off the highway. The van parked between splintered picnic tables and a stand of cottonwoods. Spent 3 days just sifting through the CubeSat data, replaying the arc signature until my eyes blurred. Every time I reached the final log, "You're not ready," I felt a weight settle deeper in my chest. It wasn't just a message, it was a verdict. But I still had proof, and I still had echo return. The day I decided to contact them again, I used an old transceiver I'd hidden in a gas station storage unit years earlier. I patched it into my laptop, masking the signal under commercial broadband traffic. The collective's relay hub in Istanbul was still live. The same cryptic prompt blinking on the screen. Your key phrase. I typed it without hesitation. Admission costs more than you have. A longer pause this time. Then : confirmed. Wormhole data verified. Echo returned. Phase 2 can proceed. I felt a cold twinge of doubt. Phase 2. How long had they been planning this? I typed back, timeline, 6 weeks minimum. No shortcuts. Relief flooded through me. Finally, something that wasn't rushed. The operators had been preparing their relay stations for years. Quiet, patient work that no one noticed because no one wanted to look. When my screen updated, I saw the list of call signs. Echo 1 Mali, Ashu, Tiwedi, Wangalia, Ashu, Tritasmania, Ashu for Northern Quebec. Recognized some of the hunt I'd seen buried in old leaks and funding reports. People like me, people who'd refused to look away. I spent those 6 weeks in a cramped sublet in Tucson, living on instant noodles and cheap coffee. Every day I signed in to the secure channel, watching as the operators posted photos of their progress. Antenna masts going up under moonlight, crates of salvaged transceivers, wiring diagrams scrawled on cardboard. Some nights I wondered if I was clinging to an illusion, if all we'd built was an elaborate theater that would collapse the second the silence protocol noticed. But each morning the logs grew longer, and each morning I felt a little more like I was part of something bigger than my own fear. On day 3, Ortiz resurfaced. Her message was brief. "You're doing what I couldn't. Keep going." I didn't know if I believed her anymore, but her words made it harder to quit. In the final week, the relay stations began low-power tests. At first, the silence protocol barely reacted, just routine spectrum sweeps, automated interference. But as the signals grew stronger, the jamming came faster. Echo 2 lost an entire night's work when their array was disabled by what they called lightning. I knew better. I sat at my laptop, watching the logs scroll by in real time, feeling something tighten in my chest. It wasn't just about hiding the truth anymore. Someone was willing to destroy anything that tried to reveal it 2 days before the main broadcast. I drove west to a relay hub near a decommissioned observatory. Ava met me at the gate, her face lined from too many sleepless nights. "Thought you'd be taller," she said. I almost laughed. Inside the facility was a patchwork of old and new surplus gear bolted to scrap metal frames, cables running across the floor like veins. Ava led me to the main console. "This is where we coordinate the signals," she explained. "Once we go live, every station will boost to full power." I studied the setup. "You really think it'll work?" Her eyes softened. "I don't know, but I know it's the best shot we've got." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the observatory's control room, staring at the star maps pinned to the walls. Somewhere beyond that darkness, something was listening, and for reasons I still didn't understand. It hadn't given up on us. I thought about all the pieces that had led here, the burnt labs, the silenced scientists, the vault door whispering its refusal. None of them had told me to stop. They'd only asked me if I was ready to hear more. On the morning of August 15th, the final pre-broadcast check began. Ava's voice came steady over the comms. "Echo 1 online. Echo 2 online. Echo 3 standby. Now online. Fate photo line." I gripped the edge of the console as she turned to me. "This is it," she said quietly. I looked around the room one last time. The walls were covered in taped-up notes and half-finished schematics, the evidence of all the people who had refused to disappear. I didn't feel ready, but I didn't feel alone at 3 o'clock UTC. The countdown began. I closed my eyes and let the hum of the equipment settle my heartbeat. When Ava spoke again, her voice was softer. "No matter what happens," she said, "thank you for not walking away." I wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't come at 3:14. The main transmitter engaged, and in that moment, I knew there was no going back. 3:14 UTC. I had imagined this moment so many times, how it would feel to push the transmitter's power too full to know for certain that someone, somewhere, would hear us. But when my hand hovered over the final control, my mind went blank, not from fear, from something that felt almost like awe. Ava stood beside me, her expression steady. "Ready," she said. I swallowed. My palm pressed the activation key. A low, resonant hum filled the observatory. On the main console, the readout surged. Signal strength, 100% echo, 1 transmitting go, 3 transmitting go, 4 transmitting E. Held my breath. Nothing happened. Then, like a ripple moving through the room, the static began. At first, it was just a hiss background noise we'd all learned to expect. But within seconds, it deepened, flattening into a hard wall of interference. "The jammers, they're trying to lock us out," Ava muttered. I gripped the edge of the console, my heartbeat skittering. "Rotate frequencies." She didn't hesitate. One by one, the relay stations shifted channels, searching for any gap in the flood of noise. For 10 long seconds, every display flickered. Then a single green indicator lit up on the console. Echo 3 signal. Clear. Which station? I asked, voice raw. "Rural Australia," Ava said, almost smiling. "They can't jam them all." I exhaled, shaky with relief. "Broadcast full sequence." Ava keyed the command. In that instant, the entire observatory seemed to tighten around. US like the walls were holding their breath. For a few seconds, nothing changed. Then the CUM speaker crackled to life. "And now you listen." The voice was calm, measured, human. or something trying very hard to sound human. Ava turned to me, her eyes wide. I didn't have time to reply. A shrill alarm erupted from the security panel near the door. I spun to the monitors. 3 SUVs were racing up the gravel access road, headlights cutting across the fields. "They're here," Ava whispered. My chest felt hollow. "Pull the recording," I said. "Take everything you can." Ava didn't argue. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, copying the logs to a drive. I moved to the rack and shut down auxiliary systems, trying to buy us a minute of darkness. Outside, the engines cut off. Car doors, slammed boots, pounded toward the building. I turned back to Ava. "You need to go," she said. "So do you." She shook her head. "I'll slow them down. You get the recording out." I wanted to protest, but in her eyes, I saw that she'd already decided. I slipped the drive into my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped it. The front door burst open, a shock of bright light flooding the corridor. Ava stepped into the doorway, her voice clear. "This facility is private property. You have no..." A voice cut her off, low and firm. "Step aside." She didn't move. I turned and ran. The emergency exit was halfway. Down the rear hallway, I hit the crash bar and stumbled into the night. The air was cold, full of dust and engine fumes. I didn't look back. I sprinted across the open ground, feet skidding in loose gravel at the tree line. I dropped to my knees, gasping from here. I could see the observatory silhouetted against the sky. Men in dark gear streamed inside. Ava was nowhere in sight. I pressed a hand over my mouth, fighting the urge to go back. But I knew I couldn't help her. Not now. My fingers dug into the dirt. The voice on the recording, "And now you listened," kept replaying in my head. It didn't feel like an accusation anymore. It felt like a threshold, like something I'd stepped across without even realizing. When the first flames licked up the side of the building, I knew they weren't here to arrest us. They were here to erase everything. I forced myself to stand. I turned away from the fire, the drive in my pocket pressing against my ribs. Somewhere out there, the other relay stations were still alive. Somewhere, someone else was listening. But I was alone now. I started walking, careful to stay in the shadows. The wind shifted, carrying the acrid smell of burning insulation. I thought about Ava's last look, calm, resigned, defiant. I didn't know if I was brave enough to be like her, but I knew I wouldn't let this end here. By dawn, I was 50 miles away, pulled over on the shoulder of an empty road. I turned on the recorder one last time. "And now you listen." The words felt different in the cold light, less like a warning, more like an invitation. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I was ready to find out. I didn't stop until I crossed into New Mexico by then. The sun was up, painting the sky a pale, brittle blue. I pulled off the highway and parked behind an abandoned gas station. My hands were still trembling. I kept expecting to see headlights in the rearview mirror, or to hear the thud of boots outside the van. But the road stayed empty. I took out the drive, the one Ava had pressed into my hand before the alarm started. It felt heavier than any weapon. I'd replayed the voice in my head so many times that I almost didn't believe it was real anymore. But I needed to hear it again, to be sure I hadn't imagined it. I connected the drive to my laptop and hit play. The words came through the tinny speaker, low and steady. "And now you listen." Then silence. I shut my eyes. They weren't warning us off. They were telling us it was time to respond. I tried to think about what came next. The network was crippled. Ava was gone. The observatory was probably still smoldering, but not everything had been erased. The other stations were out there. Tasmania, Molly, Quebec and Weed built redundancy into the system. Copies of the logs, alternate relay plans. We'd always known there was a good chance this would end in fire, so we'd planned for it. I opened a secure connection and sent out a short burst transmission. Primary station compromised. Echo files intact, awaiting further contact. No immediate reply. I leaned back against the headrest, my heart hammering. Part of me wanted to throw the laptop out the window and drive until the gas ran out. But the voice was still in my mind, calm, unhurried, like it had all the time in the world. By late afternoon, I found a cheap motel just off an empty county road. The clerk didn't look up when I checked in. I climbed the stairs to a second-floor room, bolted the door, and pulled the curtains shut. Then, I sat cross-legged on the bed and played the recording again. I studied every nuance, the slight distortion at the start, the subtle harmonics under the words. It wasn't a glitch, it was deliberate. I copied the file to 3 encrypted drives and hid them, one taped under the dresser, one slipped behind the wall vent, one wrapped in foil and buried in the lot behind. The building, if they found me, they wouldn't find all of it around midnight. My phone buzzed with a single text. Unknown number, we have your signal. You're not alone. I stared at the screen, trying to decide if it was real or bait. But something in me wanted to believe. Maybe it was desperation. Or maybe it was the quiet certainty that no matter how hard they tried to bury the truth, it would always resurface. At dawn, I made coffee in the tiny bathroom sink. The news was already full of stories about a fire at a decommissioned observatory. The same vague headlines I'd seen a dozen times before. No mention of the broadcast. No mention of the voice. I closed the laptop. I knew how this worked. Discredit. Erase. Pretend nothing happened. But this time, there were too many witnesses. Too many fragments scattered across too many servers. Even if they buried it for now, someone would keep looking. Someone would keep listening. I packed my bag slowly, trying to ignore the hollow ache in my chest. Before I left, I took one last look at the recorder. I pressed play, and the voice filled the room. And now you listen. I felt the old fear rise again, but something steadier came with its resolve. I didn't know who or what had spoken those words, but they were real, and I wasn't running anymore. I slipped the recorder into my jacket. At the door, I paused and looked back at the unmade bed, the open laptop, the last traces of the person I'd been before this started. That person was gone, and maybe that was the point. When I stepped into the morning air, it felt almost clean. The wind tugged at my hair as I walked to the van. Somewhere behind me, the network was still alive. Somewhere, the voice was waiting. I didn't know how long it would take to answer, but I knew I would, because for the first time, I understood this wasn't about proving anything to the world. It was about refusing to be silenced, about refusing to look away. I started the engine and pulled onto the road. The sky stretched out in every direction, wide and indifferent, but in that indifference there was possibility, and I was done pretending otherwise. Thanks for watching, *.